Now their economy was one of the poorest on earth, but their army was one of the largest. In fact, only the superpowers had more men under arms. As tensions rose with Peking, the Vietnamese began secretly planning for a new military campaign. But first they needed insurance from a superpower ally.
The Vietnamese prepared in their own way to set up a friendly regime in Cambodia. And in doing that, they consulted the Soviets, and they also looked at the possibilities of reactions they would get from other countries, particularly China, if the regime in Cambodia was overthrown. And this is why they consulted the Soviets and then agreed to the Soviet suggestion, which was made much earlier, to sign a treaty of friendship. The Soviets actually suggested to the Vietnamese as early as 1975 that we should sign a treaty of friendship. Vietnamese turned that down. But then in 1978, the Vietnamese approached the Soviets saying, we would like to sign the treaty, because Vietnamese knew that that treaty would buy them an insurance against likely or possible Chinese reaction to what they're going to do in Cambodia. So in November 78, the Vietnamese signed a treaty with the Soviet Union.
In December 1978, the Khmer Rouge launched a fairly small attack into Vietnam, northwest of Ho Chi Minh City in Tay Ninh province, and it was at this point that the Vietnamese hit. They decided that enough was enough. They were going to go for broke. They had neither the political nor the underlying current of a revolution in Kampuchea, and they decided to go for broke. They did this with a tactic known as the Blooming Lotus, which merely is a textbook drive straight down highways. They picked 3 main highways into Kampuchea, where all highways lead to Phnom Penh, and they simply drove down the highways, splitting up the Pol Pot forces as they went. The idea was simply to reach Phnom Penh and into western Kampuchea as quickly as possible, establish as much control of the roads and the strategic areas as possible, as quickly as possible. And this is what they did with the so-called Blooming Lotus. The Pol Pot forces were put into massive disarray. So the original tactic did work. It did establish the command, and it did get the Vietnamese into Phnom Penh, where they could quickly claim victory. It took some 2 weeks to reach Phnom Penh.
When the capital fell on the 7th of January 1979, the Vietnamese had won control of Kampuchea. After 3.5 years of terror, the Pol Pot regime had collapsed. To cap their stunning victory, the Vietnamese had even planned to kidnap Sihanouk from house arrest. But just a day before Phnom Penh was captured, the prince was released by the Khmer Rouge and flown out to China. Pol Pot himself and the leading Khmer Rouge then fled to the jungle, only hours in advance of the Vietnamese juggernaut.
It all appears very confused when communists start fighting communists, but I think it's fairly simple here, really. The border fighting merely provided an excuse for something that was bound to occur sooner or later. If there had not been border fighting, it might have had to have been achieved through a coup d'etat in Phnom Penh or an infiltration of Pol Pot's Communist Party. But Vietnamese control of Indochina is a basic tenet.
This used to be a prosperous business quarter. It's now an empty shell. The people of the city went away with only their bare hands. Had liberation been late in coming, had it been postponed by only 5 or 7 months, how many would be left of the population of Kampuchea? North of Phnom Penh, about 10 kilometers from the Po Chen Tong airfield, was a weapons yard of about 4 hectares in area. It contained thousands of tons of artillery ammunition. Weapons were sent in by Peking in such quantities that the Pol Pot Yang Seri regime ran short of storehouses. Peking was indeed full of solicitude for their protégé, the Pol Pot Yang Seri clique. visit to a secondary school. Over the past 3 years, this school was turned into a jail for political prisoners. Let us visit a cell block. This is a special block. We say it is special because in each former classroom only one prisoner was kept. His hands and feet were chained to an iron bag. When we came to this prison on the 14th of January 1979, there were 11 dead bodies in the 11 former classrooms and one body lying in the yard. In this compound, we found a large number of prisoners' files and photographs. After killing a prisoner, the torturers would cut his throat and rip up his belly, then put a number on his body, and once again take a photograph of him, dead. What did they do it for?
Pol Pot is mad, like Hitler. And the Pol Pot, they had to suppress all opposition, to wipe out all opposition, including many communists in his own party, in order to remain the master of Cambodia.
Among the photographs of the dead prisoners are portraits and statues of Pol Pot. No comment is needed.
Westerners ask me, yes, even if we believe that Pol Pot is mad, how can he have so many Khmer Rouge to support him, to serve him? And when Hitler was in power in Germany, could you say that the German people was bad, or the German elite was bad? But it happened that everybody, at least followed him, and he had at his disposal many madmen, very bad, like Himmler, etc. So Pol Pot has Himmler, his Himmler, etc. The same phenomenon.
We found these children in the office building. All were paralyzed with hunger and fear. Who are their parents? And where are they now? Just imagine the horrible days these children spent in this blood-stained compound.
That men like Pol Pot and Hitler can have supporters. That is a phenomenon, but in conformity with the misery of our mankind, our earth lacks God's luck. Our earth lacks God's luck. The Khmer Rouge, they are criminal, certainly, since they have killed so many innocent people in Cambodia. But it is not enough as a reason to give the Vietnamese the permission to colonize and Vietnamize my country.
A month and 10 days after the Vietnamese took Phnom Penh, the Chinese invaded northern Vietnam. There were obviously two reasons why they did this. One was to try to pull regular units of the Vietnamese army up onto the border and then out of Kampuchea, of course, to give Pol Pot, who was fighting for his life, a chance to regroup and perhaps counterattack the Vietnamese. The second reason was to boost the morale of countries in this area, particularly Thailand, who felt somewhat threatened by the sudden fall of Kampuchea to the invading Vietnamese army a month earlier.
The Chinese had vowed to teach their southern neighbor a lesson. In a series of furious battles, they did punish the Vietnamese, but their own casualties were extremely high. The Vietnamese rode out the storm without needing help from their Soviet allies. They emerged with their military pride intact, and above all, their control of Kampuchea was not changed in the least. Now the Vietnamese boasted, the situation in Kampuchea is irreversible. To formalize their takeover, the Vietnamese had installed a government of their own choosing. The figurehead was a former Khmer Rouge that not only served Pol Pot, they'd fought the Vietnamese and led barbaric raids across the border before they'd defected. Behind the scenes, of course, the Vietnamese would hold the reins of power. There were all too few Kampucheans they could train and trust as collaborators.
The Vietnamese invasion came with such rapidity and was so surprising that a lot of people didn't really know at all what was happening. It was obvious to people that something was happening which was causing the Khmer Rouge regime to fall apart. But from their point of view, anything was better than the Khmer Rouge, even if it was Vietnamese. It would have been better if it wasn't Vietnamese. It would have been better if it wasn't communist. But in any case, it was better than Khmer Rouge communist.
In the months of chaos after the invasion, all work on the communes ceased. Throughout the length and breadth of the country, Cambodians took to the roads. They were trekking back to the towns or their former village homes, or they simply moved from place to place in a desperate search for missing family members, or at least to learn their fate. The Pol Pot regime had ended, but the worst was still not over. The new nightmare was famine. It seemed impossible in a land of plenty, but in the wake of Vietnam's military takeover, hundreds of thousands died during 2 long years of famine.
By the middle of the year, and especially by the latter half of the year, the situation was extremely serious. In some areas, half of the population died. There was very little to eat and very little with which to produce. At the same time, you had organizational confusion. When the Khmer Rouge left these areas, the collective organization fell apart, and this left a large number of villages, maybe half of the villages, abandoned. And in this period of abandonment, what was left behind in the villages deteriorated, was stolen, was looted, in some way, shape, or form disappeared or became unusable. In particular, this affected the irrigation system. So at the village level, people tore down the irrigation system and made it serve village interests or family interests or interests which were contradictory to the overall logic of the system. And since this year was a year of water shortage, the collapse of the irrigation system caused great problems in agricultural production.
The extent of the famine within Kampuchea was hidden from the outside world. The new government, backed by the Vietnamese, was loath to admit there was any crisis at all. And for the first 6 months of 1979, they turned away offers of help from both the Red Cross and the United Nations. The famine was even more appalling for those who'd fled from the Vietnamese. These were the families and followers of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge who'd managed to escape with their leaders to the jungle. Now they were trapped. They were decimated. But the Vietnamese would not deliver the final blow. For months they were ravaged by dysentery, malaria, and starvation. Without vital supplies of food and medicine, the jungle became a graveyard. Nine months after the Pol Pot regime had fallen, the survivors were finally allowed to stream out from the jungle and cross the border to find temporary sanctuary in Thailand. For the first time, their plight was exposed to the international press and television. Suddenly, the famine in Kampuchea became headline news. When the outside world reacted, at last emergency aid began to flow. Quite separate from the Khmer Rouge, there were endless trails of refugees running a gauntlet to reach the border with Thailand. They called themselves the Free Khmers. They were risking everything for a chance to escape the famine, the Khmer Rouge, and the Vietnamese. At first, they were pushed back when the Thai authorities panicked. But once the Thais relented, hundreds of thousands were given sanctuary inside Thailand, while even more Kampucheans squatted in camps that sprawled along the border itself. Here in the wild west of Kampuchea, the camps were ruled by black marketeers and warlords. In a circus of hope and despair, they fought with each other and preyed on the refugees. To add to the terror, there were also attacks on the camps by the Vietnamese army, the Thais, the Khmer Rouge, and rival guerrilla bands. This time the attack was launched from Thailand. The shelling continued for more than 4 hours. More than 100 civilians were killed, many were children. This man cries that his last remaining son has died. He was the only one left of his family because his wife and other children had all been killed before. Now he's alone, the man says. Despite the continual violence, the border camps were a magnet because here there was famine relief that Kampucheans could count on. The lion's share of international aid was eventually shipped to the Vietnamese side. But at the height of the crisis, it was the aid that flowed directly across the border that proved to be effective. In addition to feeding the refugees on the spot, the camps were also used as a land bridge to funnel rice and other supplies back to the interior. The Vietnamese had refused to allow the road or railway to be used, so everything depended on bullock carts, bicycles, and Kampucheans on foot. Up to 100,000 traffickers were plying the trails. Their journeys to and from the border were taking at least a week each way. Some were crossing to the other side of the country and taking much longer. There were bandits lying in wait, and Vietnamese soldiers who extorted bribes. Nevertheless, in the course of a year, 150,000 tons of rice were carried across the land bridge. And apart from this, the traffickers were smuggling everything from cigarettes and coloured cloth to fishing line, medicines, music tapes. There was nothing, it seemed, that couldn't be bought and carried in from Thailand. When the traffickers emerged at the other end of their journey, there was only a token checkpoint before they were free to enter the market towns. Officially, the Vietnamese would never condone the traffic in aid and trade from the border. And from time to time, they called a halt by cutting the trails and attacking the border camps. But in general, they turned a blind eye because the black market trade was a lifeline. It was vital to Kampuchea, and it stretched right through to Vietnam. Ironically, Kampuchea had fallen back on capitalism in its crudest form. In this destitute economy, the only productive energy worth speaking of was sparked by profiteering. Compared to the black market, there was little incentive to work in the fields or even to hold a government job. Kampuchea had nothing produced for export, so gold was used as the only way to pay for the goods that came from the border. This was gold that families had hidden during the war and the term of Pol Pot's rule.
The military operation to overthrow Pol Pot was completed in 2 weeks. But the famine that followed lasted for 2 years. Why was that?
The food
yes.
Situation, yes. I would like to say that Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, we have been torn by war for 30 years. So if the European countries, they have passed through 5 years of world war, and Vietnam and the war in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia have much more bomb than twice the number of bomb in World War II. If the European countries, they need 5 years to rebuild up their countries, we need at least 30 years, if not more, because more bomb than in everywhere in the history.
But there was an immediate crisis.
Yeah.
And the
Media?
An immediate. It was a very immediate crisis, life and death. And it turned out to be death for a lot of people in 1979. Why didn't the socialist bloc respond more quickly?
We think if we have not responded to them, they could not survive, because in 79 it was near starvation.
It was real starvation.
Yes, real starvation, because the regime of Pol Pot since 75, it is enslavation, and the socialist country, they have done their best. If there is no such aid from the socialist country and from the other countries in the world, from Western Europe, from the United States, and from your country and so on, they could not overcome these difficulties.
There is no question that for a certain period of time the Vietnamese army is going to be necessary in Kampuchea in order to stop a Pol Pot takeover. If they withdrew now, the Heng Samrin regime would collapse. But I think the question of Vietnamese total withdrawal from Kampuchea simply does not arise. If you study Vietnamese history for the last 700 years in Kampuchea, the manner of conquest has always been to move people forward and follow up with the army. This time it's the other way around, that the army has come, conquered Kampuchea, occupied Kampuchea, and it is entirely logical to presume that the Vietnamese will end up with a real colonialism, a real occupation, a Vietnamese presence throughout all of Indochina, living and working as citizens of Indochina, so to speak, but ethnic Vietnamese.
The approach of Heng Samrin is really very miserable, because Heng Samrin is a puppet regime. Cambodia is losing her personality as an independent state. Now the Vietnamese, they are trying to impose on Cambodia their way of life, their Vietnamese and Soviet style communism and so on. The Cambodian people cannot be happy about it. and more there are Vietnamese settlers from Vietnam. Our people becomes slaves of Moscow and of Hanoi. The fate of Cambodia will be the same than the fate of South Vietnam. That was South Cambodia. What is the meaning of Angkor now? No significance, because we are now no more an independent state.
As an army of occupation, the Vietnamese were remarkably liberal at first. They allowed freedom of movement and Buddhist worship, as well as black marketeering. They were at pains to disguise their communism from any reminder of Pol Pot's rule. But that was bound to change. Once the famine receded, the outside world lost interest. But the Vietnamese stayed on. And the longer they stayed, the more they bred resentment. They imposed conscription and forced labor. And now there were new political prisoners, secret arrests, and torture. Inevitably, this all added fuel as the war of resistance mounted.
Amnesty claims both Cambodian and Vietnamese personnel have imprisoned and tortured thousands of political opponents. Vietnam and the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh have been battling resistance forces in Cambodia since Vietnam overthrew the infamous Khmer
The
Rouge.
Vietnamese, they are very expansionist. They are very imperialist, very colonialist. The situation, according to the Vietnamese, in Cambodia is irreversible. That means that they are determined to stay in Cambodia. So they are not ready to soften their attitude. On the contrary, they want to remain very tough.
In 1982, Sihanouk made his first return visit to Cambodian soil since the fall of Pol Pot.
We want peace, but peace without freedom, without liberty, without independence has no significance for us, is unacceptable. Reason why we will not give up fighting. We will go on fighting against the Vietnamese invaders till the day they accept to settle peacefully and in a friendly fashion the issue, the Cambodian issue, the so-called problem of Cambodia.
More than 3 years before, he'd retired in despair, vowing never to play any part in politics again. But now, in a tour of the border camps, Sihanouk announced his commitment to join a united front of resistance against the foreign control of his country. In this new coalition, Sihanouk had joined for a second time with Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge. Also included was another faction led by Son Sann. These were the Free Khmers, who'd been welded together as the Khmer People's National Liberation Front, the KPNLF. In earlier days, Son Sann had served as a prime minister under Sihanouk, and before that as a personal tutor when Sihanouk was a young king. But now they were divided, and their rift was only papered over for the sake of the coalition. We still have a long way to go, my sons, Sihanouk says. But the United Nations as a world organization and many independent countries support us. So the Vietnamese are alone and very isolated, says Sihanouk.
I made all efforts to persuade the Vietnamese to deal with me, to settle peacefully our differences. But I did not succeed. Now it is too late to have Sihanouk with the Vietnamese. I'm not accustomed to play a double game. A double game, no. But having failed in my attempts to settle the problem, our dispute directly with Hanoi. Now I decide once for all to be in the coalition. I will not resign.
For many Kampucheans, Sihanouk's return was an omen. He was still revered as the living God King. As they pressed forward to touch him in person, they called out his old title, Father King. Others were incredulous. How could Sihanouk join in a new coalition with Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge?
Yes, the horrors of the Khmer Rouge are well known. I have, 5 children of mine, 14 grandchildren of mine were killed by the Khmer Rouge. In my heart, in my spirit, there is much suffering, but we cannot, wipe out the Khmer Rouge. So we have to try to soften their behavior. They used to be very cruel, and I continue to say to them, please avoid to be cruel. Please be like the other Cambodians. And it seems that they would like to listen more or less to me. I am not sure that they have changed their mind, but the fact is that they are intelligent enough to see that they cannot go on as they used to be before.
China would continue to back the Pol Pot forces come what may. Chinese trucks and generous military aid were shipped through Thailand to revive the Khmer Rouge. The Chinese declared that these guerrillas would bleed the Vietnamese. Pol Pot himself had survived, but he discreetly retired from any public political role. However, as military commander, he was vital to regrouping the Khmer Rouge and mounting their war of attrition to wear down the Vietnamese. Once they'd recovered, the Khmer Rouge were able to mobilize up to 40,000 fighters. Later, the Vietnamese succeeded in overrunning all the camps and guerrilla bases along the border. This was a serious blow to the other resistance factions, but the Khmer Rouge were undaunted. Operating in small teams, their guerrillas continued to range throughout the country, laying ambushes and striking terror. Understandably, there was nothing the Khmer Rouge could ever do to redeem themselves in the eyes of most Kampucheans. Nevertheless, they made a number of public gestures in a vain attempt to improve their image. In a chilling understatement, the Khmer Rouge leaders now conceded that, yes, some mistakes were made. But of course they were not to blame for the mass murders or any policy of genocide. These were conspiracies hatched by the Vietnamese, they said. Incredibly, after a series of public meetings, the Khmer Rouge claimed that they had renounced communism altogether. Henceforth, the Communist Party itself had been disbanded. Pol Pot's closest partner and his deputy prime minister was Ieng Sary. Speaking at a Khmer Rouge base inside Kampuchea, he denies that dissolving the Communist Party was just a ploy. We started our Communist Party in order to oppose the Vietnamese. Regardless of communist theory, we could not abolish the borders between our countries.
But the main objective of the founding of this party is to fight against the Vietnamese ambition, expansionist ambition to swallow Campuchia. And it has been right from the beginning. The Vietnamese was always against the founding of this party, because for the Vietnamese, they want, as you can see, as you know, their ambition is to have just one party, one people, one country in the Indochina.
On the diplomatic front, Thailand and its anti-communist partners in Southeast Asia found common cause with China in backing the resistance. But they were embarrassed by Pol Pot's reputation. So to win respectability for the resistance, the ASEAN nations had lobbied and pressured for a coalition with the Khmer Rouge, still the official government of democratic Kampuchea.
Son San and Sihanouk, despite they hate and fear the Khmer Rouge, they have to associate themselves with the Khmer Rouge and ASEAN itself, the United States themselves. They have to vote for the tripartite coalition, including the Khmer Rouge at the UN. Everybody condemned the Khmer Rouge in the speech. But when they vote, they have to vote, they vote for the Khmer Rouge. Even before the forming of the coalition with Son San and Sihanouk, the United States and all Western countries, including Australia, voted for the Khmer Rouge. Always, every year at the General Assembly of the UN. Why? Because there is a necessity. I want to play the role of a harmonizer, a link between all political parties. I must continue the all good tradition of ancient Khmer kings. Destiny has decided to put Cambodia forever till the end of the life of our planet Earth, close to Vietnam. We want to be friend, a good friend, loyal friend to Vietnam, for Vietnam. But the Vietnamese fait accompli in Cambodia is unacceptable. I want all Cambodian parties to unite in order to be able to make peace in Cambodia and to rebuild our nation. But up to now, I am not very successful because the other parties, Son San's party, Khmer Rouge party, Heng Samrin's party, they are not ready to unite, you know, but I will continue to try to persuade them to come together closer and closer to each other and to unite with my help.
In characteristic style, Sihanouk made frequent threats to resign from the coalition. Then, in 1987, he did resign, but only temporarily. Henceforth, he would reconsider his position with the coalition from year to year. He said this was to protest against Khmer Rouge attacks on his supporters. But far from retiring, Sihanouk began a dialogue with the Heng Samrin regime. The prince would be torn between hope and frustration, but this was a first step towards reconciliation with the Vietnamese side.
You know, we cannot remake history. I do not think that I make serious mistakes. May I quote, Sihanouk made mistakes like any other man, but he was a fantastic diplomat and a great nationalist. I apologize, but because Silvana Fua wrote this. He kept his people well fed, happy, and at peace by walking a very thin tightrope between the big powers. After living in this country, one can only wish the best for these people, and right now the best one can wish for them is the speedy return of Sihanouk. said one diplomat wrote Miss Silvana for. So, you know, you should see Mr. Lonald, because if he had to go back to the starting point, would he like to destroy his country by a coup d'etat against Sihanouk? Or would he like to maintain Sihanouk as head of state? I think your question should be put to Lonald.